long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
Today is a special episode where I, Ken Katkin, will be interviewing Howard Blum, the author of the new book, The Spy Who Knew Too Much. This is a book about a particular Cold War espionage mystery, and it's really sort of the story of two particular people. Pete Bagley, who was a CIA agent in the Soviet bloc division, who became very caught up in the mole hunts and ultimately had his career ended by that. And John Arthur Paisley, who was a long time on and off CIA agent who mostly worked in what are the so-called white divisions, not the counter-espionage divisions, but who ends up after a mysterious suicide, having his story looked into by a long retired Pete Bagley. Howard Blum wrote this book. He's an author of many books about espionage and other subjects. He's been a reporter for many great newspapers, including the New York Times. And I'm very pleased to have him as my guest on the Politics Guys today. Welcome, Howard.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. So I mentioned in the introduction there that your book ultimately, I think, revolves around the stories of two key Cold War figures. Pete Bagley, whose real name was Tenant Bagley, but everybody called him Pete, and John Arthur Paisley, who was much less well known of a personage, really until his suicide. But his suicide, if it was a suicide, got him a lot of attention, and people have been looking into the mystery of that ever since. So let me just sort of start by asking you to explain, who these two protagonists are. First, Pete Bagley. Who was Pete Bagley?
Well, Pete started out as a field man in the FBI. He was a gung-ho spy who spent the early parts of the Cold War, going around back alleys in Europe, putting himself in danger behind enemy lines. And he came from a family with a long naval tradition. There are 7 boats in the U.S. fleet named after his relatives. It's a whole flotilla, in effect, of Bagley people. And he had this background, this commitment to duty, and he was on the fast track to moving up in the CIA hierarchy. He was head of the Soviet counterintelligence division. Arthur Paisley was more of a self-made hardscrabble man. He grew up in an impoverished family in Arizona. His grandfather supported the family by mowing lawns, getting up early in the morning in the hot Arizona sun, going off and mowing the lawns of rich people's houses. And Paisley gets an early interest in electronics. He uses this interest in electronics to lead to the Merchant Marines. During the early days of World War II, he's going off on Merchant Marine missions, really involving Soviet Union. And he's getting experience in all of this. Come 1948, he's working for the newly formed United Nations, and he's on a mission there with one of the first doomed United Nations peacekeeping missions in the Middle East. And at this point, he's recruited by the CIA to be sort of an asset. And he seems to break off with them. He goes to University of Chicago, get his degree, and he joins the CIA as an analyst after graduation. And this would seem to be, really sort of the backwaters, or the passive backwaters of the CIA, the deep thinkers, the owls, as they're called. But Paisley is injecting himself into many very complex operations involving defectors, involving knowledge of Soviet electronics. And these two careers seem on totally parallel but unconnected courses, moving up in the hierarchy as events play out in the book, and sort of brings them together after Paisley's suicide.
Right. Now, let's I guess just because it happens first chronologically, let's talk about why it was that Pete Bagley had to take early retirement from the agency, because he was retired from the agency before he got particularly interested in Paisley's death. So why was Bagley retired early from the agency?
Well, he wasn't necessarily forced out, but in a sense, he was. His reputation was besmirched. What had happened is Paisley was working a case in 1963 in Switzerland. There's a walk-in. A walk-in is an agent who comes knocking on your door bearing gifts, and you don't know whether this agent has the real thing, why he's coming to share these secrets, or is he spreading disinformation. He met with a Soviet major by the name of Yuri Nasenko. Nasenko comes and tells him that he wants to be an agent in place, go back to the Soviet Union. He'll tell Bagley what's really going on. And Bagley takes this information and he thinks, well, I'm a hero. This is great. And he's called back to Washington and to report on all he's found from this agent. He's going to be running behind enemy lines, because this is sort of the gold standard you want. You want to get someone right in the enemy's house, right, working in Moscow Center. And he has this guy, Nasenko. Well, he starts talking to this with James Angleton. James Angleton is the head of counterintelligence at the CIA. He's a mythic figure. In many ways, he was Pete's mentor. And Angleton says, I want you to read something first before you take everything that this defector is saying as gospel. And he shows him a report from another defector, which includes most of the same information, as well as a very important point. This defector, his name is Golitsyn, this defector says that the Soviets will send someone over here to impugn everything I'm saying because they want to hide a big secret. The secret is that they have a mole inside the agency that's telling them everything, and that's why we've been blowing investigation after investigation. That's why our agents are being rounded up in the field. When Bagley reads this, he realizes he's been played. But Nasenko goes back to Russia, and he's pretty quiet. In fact, he's very quiet until 2 months after the Kennedy assassination. In January 64, Nasenko raises his head again, and he says he wants to have a crash meeting with Bagley in Switzerland. So they go through all the meet protocols, and they meet outside a cinema. The location of the safe house is sort of passed to him in a brush path, and the two agents come up again at this rather posh safe house in Geneva. And then Nasenko makes a startling revelation. He says not only was he intimately involved in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald when he first came to Russia, and the decision was made by the KGB to allow him to stay in the country, but afterwards, after the assassination, he got to review the entire KGB case file on Lee Harvey Oswald. So even though Bagley has his doubts about this defector, there's a Warren Commission investigating Russia's ties to the Kennedy assassination and what role Oswald played. He has to take Nasenko back to the United States. So Nasenko is brought back to the United States, and Bagley is interviewing him. Interestingly enough, also during this time, so is John Arthur Paisley interviewing him. They're both involved in interrogation. And Bagley is having some real doubts about Nasenko. He's not telling the same story. He's not this. And these doubts lead him to take some extreme measures. Nasenko is thrown into what a 12 by 12 sort of cell that's built on the CIA Camp Perry, their training camp. And he's kept there for over a year. He's not allowed even to go out, see daylight for a while. It is harsh is one word, torture is maybe a more accurate word. But Paisley feels he's like an Ahab now. He's totally committed to getting his man, and he feels he's doing it for all the right reasons. We've got to know what happened to the president. He has to solve this mystery of why the Soviets would want to send a defector here as an agent in place back into America. And he's convinced, and so is Angleton, there can only be one reason for this. What's the one reason? That this defector is working hand in hand with a mole who's already burrowed his way into the U.S. spy establishment. So that's the setup, I think, of Pete Paisley. And then after Nosenko is more or less cleared, what happens in the CIA, which is many ways the book will show a nest of viper. There's they're cutthroat guys who wind up cutting each other's throats. Pete Paisley is investigated himself for being the mole. He's eventually cleared. He's allowed to go off with honor to become head of the station chief in Brussels, Belgium. But when it's time for his retirement, he decides it might be the wiser thing to retire. He can never have the career he wants. Once questions are raised about you, those questions remain with you forever. And also, his way at the Cold War, looking at Nosenko, is now being called paranoia. Sick think. He's been besmirched and impugned. And so he leaves the agency and tries to make another life for himself, in many ways leaving that behind.
You told the long tale of the long version of the tale, I guess, of the controversy about whether Golitsyn was the true defector or whether Nosenko was the true defector. And, because I think part of what you said was that Golitsyn, who had defected 2 years before Nosenko, had predicted that there would be many false defectors sent later to discredit Golitsyn, because Golitsyn was alleging that there was a big mole inside the CIA, and the Soviets very much wanted to discredit that allegation. Now, one thing that you mentioned there was that the CIA investigated a number of people as the big mole, including Bagley, including Dave Murphy, who was the chief of the Soviet Bloc Division at the time, and including Angleton himself. And in fact, there was a fairly thorough report written by Claire Petty that concluded that it was Angleton who was the big mole. But I think the ultimate finding of the CIA was that there never was a big mole. Now, in the book, I think because you, although you write with a neutral voice, you somewhat take, I think, seem to take Bagley's side sometimes. And would you say that's a fair characterization of the book, that you're sort of telling Bagley's version of the events, or is that not a fair?
I think that's very accurate. I think Bagley is a hero in this story. He's going on this quest against insurmountable odds, institutional and also from the enemy, trying to find this mole. I think Angleton is more sinned against than sinning in many ways. And I think Bagley believed that too. Sure, Angleton went to extremes, but I think he was right. That's the job of a counterintelligence agency, to look for moles. And I think that history has showed us that there's sort of been a continuum of treason, that the CIA has been infiltrated in the past, and it's hard to believe that it hasn't been infiltrated now, especially when we're being so lax in our counterintelligence activities.
I definitely did take that perspective from the book, so I'm glad that you confirmed that was your perspective, that Angleton was right more often than he was wrong. And I think the official verdict of the CIA to this day, as well as I think the verdict of most writers who've written about this, would be contrary to that, right? That Angleton caused a lot of damage to the CIA, probably more harm than good. And let me go through a few of the sort of concerns about Angleton, and you can respond to them if you like. But for one thing, when Kim Philby was brought under suspicion in 1951 after the defections of his housemate Guy Burgess and also the British diplomat Donald Maclean. There was a lot of discussion within the U.S. intelligence community about whether Philby was also a mole. The FBI, particularly William Harvey, were absolutely adamant that Philby was also a mole. And Angleton, who was probably in a better position than any in terms of the amount of information that he had to reach a conclusion on this, he was really the one voice in the intelligence community that wrongly said Philby was not a mole. I wonder what your thoughts about that are.
Angleton and Philby had a very close relationship. They would spend many afternoons drinking together, lunches that stretched on from one martini to 5 martinis, well into the afternoon. He was fooled by that, and perhaps that added to his energized search for a mole. Did Angleton go too far? Definitely. But was he wrong? Was Paisley wrong? As you said, I take what I believe is a revisionist approach to this. I think Angleton was right that the agency was infiltrated, that Paisley, as the book works out, finds a confirmation in the existence of the 14th Department, which is sending penetration agents into the United States, that Russia is involved in a very aggressive counterintelligence program against the U.S., and that history has proven Angleton right with Hansen, Aldrich Ames, the spy who spied for Cuba, time after time again, and it's hard to believe that something like that isn't happening now. Again, Angleton's entire mystique, his persona of being the super sleuth, of working in the darkened room, made him an easy target. But that doesn't mean, and he also went to extremes, as we discussed before, that Paisley did in Nosenko was tortured. But the fact that Nosenko was a deception agent, I think Paisley very well establishes that, and I think Angleton was correct with believing that the CIA was infiltrated.
You agree that Angleton was wrong about Philby, though? That he was wrong in that case. He was wrong about Philby.
He was mistaken, yes, but yes, and it was a big mistake. But at the same time, the damage when Angleton was involved in this had already been done. Philby was at that point removed out of Washington D.C. But just because he was mistaken, that doesn't mean he didn't learn from his mistakes and still give up the pursuit. I mean, both Paisley and Angleton were patriots trying to get to the bottom of why our intelligence operations were becoming undone. They both believed that something was wrong with the agency, and they were working to solve that.
So let me also ask about Dave Murphy. So Angleton also accused Dave Murphy of being the big mole, and he was persuaded of that for quite a long time. Do you think it's possible that Dave Murphy was the big mole?
From what I've read, I don't think that Murphy was a role. You see, part of the job of counterintelligence is be always on guard. It's not a passive occupation. It's more aggressive. You have to be searching for the mole. Sometimes you're going to focus on the wrong person. Where it becomes dangerous is how you treat the people that you're focusing your investigations on. That's where Angleton went too far in some cases. Murphy, one of them.
Right, because with Murphy, after he accused Murphy, there was a big investigation, and Murphy was exonerated. But even after Murphy was exonerated, and the CIA sent Murphy to be head of the CIA station in Paris, Angleton, called his friends in French intelligence and said, "Don't share any information with Murphy because he's a Soviet mole." Would you think that was he was going too far there? I take it, right?
Well, I think at that point, Angleton knew, as the American intelligence establishment knew, that French intelligence was infiltrated. It was replete with at least one mole, and in the national interest, he was giving a warning about Murphy. I think that was perhaps a prudent, until all the facts are out, a prudent position to be in. As we point out, Paisley was under investigation for a year, a little over a year, and he was exonerated just like Murphy was exonerated. But this is, the price you pay for counterintelligence. And I think, these days we've maybe swung too far in the opposite direction. There is not an aggressive counterintelligence division in the CIA. There's not a unified counterintelligence approach really between the CIA and the FBI and the Defense Intelligence Agency. And I think it's putting us in jeopardy.
It was the conclusion of the CIA that Angleton's mole hunt, which the CIA referred to as the monster plot or the sick think, this idea that, just about every CIA agent of high stature who'd had contact with any Soviets could potentially be the mole, and his refusal to let that go even after investigations exonerated the individuals that he named. The CIA ultimately concluded that that did more harm to U.S. counterintelligence operations than even a mole could have done.
I think you're talking as the CIA as a monolithic organization. I think some elements in the CIA, certainly William Casey thought that, and he was, director. But there are other elements to this day, very vocal, very well entrenched in the CIA, who think just the opposite. And I think Pete Paisley, his story, part of the reason I wrote this book was as a response to the elements in the CIA who have vilified Angleton, who talk about the monster plot, who talk about sick think, who have made Yuri Nisenko a hero. After he was cleared of all charges, he was put on the CIA payroll. At one point, he goes to the CIA auditorium and gives a presentation, and he gets a standing ovation from the CIA agents. And I think anyone reading my book will see the point by point that Paisley's investigation makes, which certainly impugn Nisenko's credentials.
The main evidence that initially led both Angleton and Bagley to decide right away in 1963 that they didn't trust Nisenko was the warnings of Golitsyn. So I wonder, what do you think about Golitsyn? Do you think he was a true defector whose information was credible?
I think he was a very complicated man who was a true defector. His information was credible. I think what you stated about Angleton and Paisley's just accepting Golitsyn's word on Nisenko. I mean, there's, point by point. I mean, Paisley literally wrote a 1,000-page report, point by point, saying all the questions, the dubious statements, and the outright lies that Nisenko made. Nisenko was not allowed to testify to the Warren Commission because even the CIA, who reinvigorated Nisenko's reputation, they still had doubts about what he was telling the truth about the Kennedy assassination. They said, well, everything else he said is true, but everything he said about the Kennedy assassination was basically a lie or disinformation, but we'll accept him anyway. And I think that's what their position boils down to. I don't think I'm doing it an injustice by describing it so capriciously. I think the case against Nisenko is very strong. And if Nisenko was a deception agent, well, I think that justifies what Angleton and Paisley were doing. As Paisley says, Nisenko is the Rosetta Stone for understanding everything that happened later and everything that was going on, to understand what Russia's 14th Department, which was a deception agency, was doing in their aggressive operations.
Yeah, I just want to ask some specific follow-ups on Golitsyn and then talk more about Nisenko. So Golitsyn adamantly told the CIA that the Sino-Soviet split was a ruse, was a fake. Was Golitsyn right about that?
At the time, he might have been right, but history has proved him wrong. I mean, I don't know. Well, Golitsyn defected. What year was it? 56, I think, something like that.
I think it was a little bit later than that, but I'll defer to you.
Well, again, his information got on the Sino-Soviet split got old very quickly. His firsthand information, that is.
Yeah, and he also alleged that there was a big mole not only in the CIA but also in the State Department, and he alleged that it was Averell Harriman. You think that information was correct?
His allegations about Harriman came out later, and I think they were utterly wrong. I mean, here's the thing with a defector. You have to go over everything they say, and they're not entirely right all the time. And in the course of their defection, they tend to aggrandize things they're saying. They might come in, they want to keep their job in effect. They want to prove that they have a reason for working as an analyst. And I think as Golitsyn's career with the agency went on, I think he embroidered a bit as the years passed. And I think certainly the Harriman speculation was one of those.
And by the way, I looked up while we were talking when Golitsyn defected, and it was December of 1961, so it wasn't that long before Nosenko defected. And then the other one I wanted to ask about Golitsyn was in the mid 1960s when the Czech uprising and the Prague Spring happened. Golitsyn said he was certain that the uprising was staged, that the Soviets were actually behind it, and that the Soviets would never invade Czechoslovakia. So was Golitsyn's information good about that?
No, he was wrong about that. He also, I mean, you can point to other things too that Golitsyn said. Golitsyn said that Lee Harvey Oswald went to the movie theater after the shooting to meet his Soviet handler. But that doesn't mean that he was wrong about other big issues, about Nosenko's being a plant and about the 14th Department existing. Okay. And about being a mole in the CIA. I mean, you can't have it. I think it's a mistake in intelligence matters to think one source is 100% right or 100% wrong. And that's why when when the agency would castigate things as a monster plot or paranoia, I think a more selective and refined and fact-based approach is necessary. That's why you investigate people, and then why you subsequently clear them. That's why Dave Murphy is allowed to go off again, and Pete Begley was allowed to go off again after they were cleared. But that doesn't mean you don't do the job of looking at these people if you want to keep your agency safe.
Okay, now I'll stop haranguing you about Golitsyn and let's move on to Nosenko, who I know you prefer to talk about. So, yeah, it's fine. Yeah, so Nosenko, I think the main issue.
I think about Golitsyn, there might be maybe 4 paragraphs in my 500-page book about it. But
no, I know. I agree. You didn't focus on Golitsyn so much, but I thought it was important because I think that if it hadn't have been for Golitsyn, there wouldn't have been immediate suspicion cast on Nosenko. Right, the suspicion that was cast on Nosenko happens because Angleton already believes Golitsyn's claims.
There wouldn't have been the initial suspicion, but then once Nosenko started being interviewed in depth by Begley and other people in the Soviet division, the suspicions grew.
Yeah, so I want to focus on the biggest one first this time rather than working up to it. So the issue about the Kennedy assassination. So Nosenko comes over just a couple of weeks after the Kennedy assassination, and he'd already been in a dialogue with Bagley and other CIA agents for a year and a half before that, but he was still a defector in place, or you would say a supposed defector in place at that time. But he comes over a couple of weeks after the Kennedy assassination, and the big bombshell that he delivers is that he says he's reviewed the Oswald files within the KGB, and he's certain that the KGB played no role in the Kennedy assassination. Now, a lot of Nosenko's detractors, including Bagley and Angleton, later including writers like Edward J. Epstein, a lot of Nosenko's detractors say, well, that's the specific important piece of disinformation that he was sent over here at that time to convey. And I guess, do you think that was disinformation? Do you think the Soviets actually had a role in the Kennedy assassination?
You're asking two different questions. Was it disinformation? Yes. Did the Soviets have a role in the assassination? I don't believe they did. I don't believe that Bagley did or Angleton believed that. But I think the Russians at that point were so determined or so fearful that the assassination of an American president by a man who had lived in Russia previously could backfire on them, and that there could be a nuclear war. I mean, they were trying to prevent it. And so they took an operative who they originally had designated for a deception operation to take the spotlight off the mole that already existed, and they now had to do an about-face. They had to use him for another operation. And he came here and he said things about his knowledge of the Oswald investigation by the KGB that just didn't make any reasonable sense. He was in the second department. Why would he be looking at this? And then he said he read the entire file, and he said first it was as big as maybe a quarter of an inch, and then he said it went on to 8 volumes. Then he denied having said that in the tapes, and on and on and on. As I said, Bagley wrote a paper on this in the CIA that was called the 1,000 Pages. And Bagley was a graduate student, and he was very big on his research and his footnotes, and perhaps pretentiously or so. And it became, he was maybe his own worst enemy in that. But point by point by point, I think it was fairly well established, even by Nosenko's supporters in the CIA, that he was not telling an accurate story about the Kennedy assassination. What I find fascinating is how the CIA could have this sort of bifurcated mind. Well, okay, he lied to us about the Kennedy assassination or aggrandized his role in that, but everything else he said is true. And I just don't buy it. I think they both came from the same root.
But aren't you having the same bifurcated mind when you say, well, he lied to us about the Kennedy assassination, except that the essence of what he said was true, right? That the Soviets weren't involved in the assassination of President Kennedy.
Well, no, I think there's been other substantiating evidence. I've seen no evidence that can make the case that the Soviets were involved in the Kennedy assassination. Do you believe that the Soviets were?
No, not at all. But I don't believe Nosenko about very much. But I agree with you that he was lying there. I don't think that he that necessarily means he was a dispatched agent saying things that the Soviets told him to say. I think it's equally as likely that he was lying so that he could raise his own stock with the CIA, and that this is the kind of information that would make them very anxious to take him as a defector and to give him a job in the CIA, et cetera. I think, if once you sort of accept the idea that he's lying, which it sounds like you and I both accept, then there's and also the idea that the Soviets weren't involved in the Kennedy assassination, which it sounds like you and I also both accept. I think there's a lot of reasons that he could have been lying about that.
And quite frankly, that's what makes this whole subject so fascinating. That's why I like to think my book can engage a reader, because you have a mental discussion as you turn the pages. I mean, you're following Pete Bagley trying to make sense of it. And you can look at it with, well, he's totally off base. He's going in wrong directions and drawing wrong conclusions. Or you can deduce the way he is at the facts and come to the same conclusion. And it's, I'm trying to put the reader in the shoes of a man who's on a quest to solve a mystery. And you don't have to, and because it's real life, not a Le Carré novel, you don't have to agree with the conclusion.
Right, that's right. Now let's also talk about the mole hunt then. So I think one of the things it sounds that you and I do differ on about Nosenko is whether his allegation that there was a big mole was accurate or not. And I think to sort of delve into that, we might have to distinguish a little bit between a big mole and small moles, because certainly there were small moles. Your book talks at length about two of them, I guess, or one or two, depending how you count, the Czech agents, Karl and Hannah Ketcher. So they were certainly moles inside the agency at the time. And there were other small moles here and there, various people who worked in, the embassy garage in Moscow or things like that. But how would you distinguish between a big mole and a small mole?
I mean, I sort of disagree with your premise that there are big moles and small moles. I think a mole is very dangerous. And one of the things about moles, we never know what they've given away. I mean, we would never, you talked about the Czech moles, we've to this day, there's never been enough backbeatings to get out to authoritatively discern what they gave up and how effective they were. I think any mole is a dangerous one. We can talk in present times. There was a, quote, little mole in the CIA who in the China department, and he wound up having, according to congressional investigation, I think 10 people were executed because of him. But he was, quote unquote, a little mole. I think that's a big mole.
You think someone like, would you call someone like Eddie Lee Howard a big mole, or would that be fair to characterize someone like that as a small mole?
I'm not necessarily sure he is a mole as much as a traitor.
Right. Well, I mean, if there's no distinction between big moles and small moles, then
maybe
why
make the distinction between moles and traitors?
Okay.
I mean, is a cipher clerk who gives something up a mole or a traitor? Is John Walker a mole, or is he a traitor?
Right. I mean, to me, I guess I'm not fussed about that terminology, but I guess the concept I was trying to get at more was if there was someone at a high level who had access to a lot of things that other people in the CIA were working on, not just things that they themselves were working on. That's kind of what I took to be the working definition of the big mole. Whereas my idea of a working definition of a small mole is just someone who can, they're working on particular things and they might reveal some of those things, but they don't have access at a very high level to a lot of the work of the whole agency. And I thought that that sort of was the distinction between the Nosenko allegation of a big mole, that there was an American Philby. So, Philby had been at such a high level in the British Secret Service that he could reveal almost anything that the British Secret Service was doing in its anti-Soviet operations, not just small, not just things that he himself was working on. And I took Nosenko's allegation to be that there was someone like that inside the CIA. And I guess, do you think John Arthur Paisley was that person? And now we'll have to move over to John Arthur Paisley.
I think, I'm not sure I accept your vocabulary or your nomenclature. For example, a more damaging spy than a Philby was, I said, John Walker, a Navy guy who gave up our codes. But he was just, in your terminology, a little mole. But he was, in many ways, the most damaging spy who ever spied against America. Paisley's role, he was tied into lots of key operations. He had his hands in many cases by working with Soviet defectors. He was also involved with Nosenko. The case has been made that he was Nosenko's handler. I think Paisley was a mole high up in the CIA. I think he was a dangerous mole. I think that's one of the points that my book makes. And I think his role in the CIA has never been sufficiently investigated. And I would like to think that one of the consequences of my book, one of the benefits I hope it would have, is that there would be an investigation, a congressional investigation that has been called for in times, into the role that Paisley played get to the bottom of things and see who, if anyone, followed in his footsteps.
I'm sorry. Let's talk about Paisley now. Paisley, let me just just tell his whole story, and then we can start talking about it.
Well, the whole story that begins with his suicide is that.
Actually, why not start at the beginning and work up to his suicide? I think the book starts with the suicide, but let's talk here sort of chronologically. You mentioned already he comes to the attention of Angleton in 1948 when Paisley's working as a radio operator for the United Nations in Israel, in the brand new state of Israel, and he's present when Count Volk Bernadotte is assassinated. And I think so. You maybe start there, and so that's how he came to the attention of Angleton. Then he does a few other things, winds up joining the CIA. So sort of take that right up, and then we'll start having conversation about it. I think.
Well, Angleton at this time is touring the Middle East, and what he's doing, weirdly enough, he's collecting assets. He's building his own private army. He's putting people on government payrolls, giving them what I think it was a munificent $500 a month, but they're reporting directly to him. And it seems that Paisley was one of the people he recruited as part of his private army. And then Paisley just sort of disappears, in a sense. He doesn't stay in, you would think, on his radio at the UN and perform a radio role. He goes off to the University of Chicago. He goes there, but he keeps on shipping out for long terms, for summers, for taking terms off to the Merchant Marines and going to the Soviet Union on trips. Is he working for Angleton at this point? Is he working for the Russians at this point? Is he recruited by the Russians? It would be Angleton, and I don't really discuss this in the book because I couldn't find confirmation, but he thought he was recruited in later years when Paisley is now working at the CIA as an analyst, and he's sent off to various arms conferences, and one in Finland. And Angleton made the case. Paisley was there to try to represent the United States and say, well, this is what we were doing, and find out what the Russians were doing. And at this point, Angleton believed that Paisley was recruited. Angleton then sort of goes off the scene, and Paisley then goes off. It takes a year off from working at the CIA, and he's sent to England. And this is what normally happens. He's working as a liaison to the British Defense Agency, and this is what usually happens to agents when they sort of have a sense of battle fatigue. And while he's there in England, he's given a flat right by the U.S. Embassy a block away, or back then it was in Grosvenor Square. He's rented a private mailbox by a U.S. base outside of town up north where we have nuclear bombers. And what's he doing there? And who's he working for? Is he working for Angleton or the Russians? The mystery continues as Paisley is now works as an analyst. He works with defectors. He's interviewing defectors at a CIA defection facility called Arlington Hall on the Maryland shore. He also is part of Bagley's team of people that's interviewing Lysenko. And he's pretty vitriolic, vituperative to Lysenko. And yet afterwards, once he retires, this is Paisley, he's visiting Lysenko at Lysenko's new home in North Carolina. So again, their relationship continues, and it continues oddly. In his retirement, which is clearly a phony retirement because he still had access to the CIA and he never reported to his job at the insurance company. His secretary didn't even know what he looked like. He's working for a government finding that's been set up by then CIA Director George Bush to make a competition between two sides in the CIA to get the latest assessment of Russian nuclear power. And Paisley is the liaison to the Hawks. He's sort of clear to the world, and he's able to find out anything he wants about our enemy, and he gives them this information. He's also leaking to the press. And as is revealed by a New York Times reporter after his death. And that's the interesting thing about someone like Paisley, what makes him a fascinating character. He's serving two masters, but he seems to serve each one at a different time with complete loyalty, or do the best job he can, even while he's then later betrays him. So this is the strange character that attracts Bagley's attention after he retires, and that's a very broad and very brief and very episodic summary of Paisley's career.
You mentioned now, and also in the book a lot, that you find it suspicious that Paisley spent time with Nosenko after Nosenko had been cleared, and in fact, after Nosenko was employed by the CIA and ultimately retired from the CIA. Why would that be strange? I mean, Nosenko had been cleared and was employed by the CIA. Why was it strange that...
the strange is that they were so belligerent, or Paisley was so belligerent to Nosenko in these interrogations, according to Bagley's memory. And second, how did they become friends? Why did he find a need to check him out, to sail down to North Carolina and spend time with Paisley, and such a long time, 10 days at a stretch? These are all, I find that problematic.
I mean, Bagley himself, for instance, became friends with KGB Lieutenant General Sergei Kondrashev right after the end of the Cold War. And I realized that, with Paisley and Nosenko, this is before the end of the Cold War, but this is after a time that Nosenko had been fully exonerated. So why is it strange for former antagonists to become friendly with each other, or how is that different than Bagley becoming friendly with Sergei Kondrashev?
Well, Bagley was on a mission, in effect, and they did not have a relationship prior to that. They were just lofty figures in the opposition to each one another. They had a knowledge of each other, but not a relationship. Paisley had a relationship with Nosenko, a vitriolic one, and yet they somehow become bosom buddies. And why? How did this come about? I think it raises a lot of questions. You think it makes sense that it was just banal or benign?
Yeah, I mean, because they were both working for the CIA for a long period of time. I don't know whether their paths crossed professionally or not, but it doesn't seem impossible. And it does seem to me like I've certainly experienced episodes in my own life where there's people that I had great enmity for at one point in time and years later reconciled with. I don't think that's such an unusual thing.
I think it's improbable at best, but
I guess that raises the question then, what do you think that Nosenko was still doing that late? Like, even if you think he was dispatched here with certain disinformation, say to say that the Soviets weren't involved in the Kennedy assassination and to cast doubt on the big mole theory that had been propagated by Golitsyn, even if that's what he was dispatched here for as a Soviet dispatched agent, you think he was still doing things for the Soviets 12, 14, 15 years later? And what kind of things?
Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think there were still agents in place working for the Soviets, and I think Nosenko had a knowledge of this, and so did Paisley, and they were in effect handlers to the next generation that was embedded in the agency and elsewhere in the government.
Well, I mean, immediately after the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, there was a window of time where a lot of the KGB files got opened up. People who had access to them were willing to sell them to Western writers and journalists and things like that. A lot of books were written. Were there any revelations in any of those materials? For instance, we learned a lot more about what people like Kim Philby had specifically been doing, a lot more about what George Blake specifically had been doing. In any of those revelations, did we learn a lot more about anything that say Nosenko had been doing?
I think the most we learned was the existence through Bagley of this 14th department headed by General Bribanoff that was involved in aggressive counterintelligence. As for the specifics, we didn't get that. And I think that's one of the problems with our own counterintelligence program, that we haven't pursued that. I think one of the lasting effects, really, of this internal war within the CIA, as you know, talk about Bagley and Angleton on one side, Colby and the others on another side, writers on one side, and David Martin, Ed Epstein on the other, is that we've sort of made battle lines rather than trying to investigate. Let's say the questions or your conclusions are correct. Okay, let's go in there into the weeds and establish it. Or let's say Bagley was correct. Let's try to establish that he was. I think that's a real hole in our intelligence activities and something that needs to be remedied.
I would agree with that, but I think there was a window of time where a lot of that work was done. It's going to be a lot harder to do it now that Vladimir Putin's in charge of all those files than it was in the early 90s. But I think we learned,
for a while he's in charge.
Yeah, at least for a while he's in charge, right? I don't know that we're going to get the KGB files open to us in the near future, but maybe in the middle near future. But they were open to us for a few years, and that's sort of what I'm asking about, is why we were able to learn about the specific work of a lot of Soviet penetration agents in the West. But yet, even though there'd been such a mystery, people were very interested in Nosenko. Maybe people were less interested in John Arthur Paisley at that time, but people were very interested in Nosenko, and I just haven't heard of anything coming out after the end of the Cold War that really documents any work that Nosenko was doing in the United States after he defected.
I mean, Bagley goes and acts as his own sort of intelligence service after the Berlin Wall falls down, after there's this sort of rapprochement, brief as it is, between the East and West, and he cultivates a group of former KGB officers, the spokesman for which is Khrandyshev, and Khrandyshev tells him point blank that Nosenko was a deception agent, that he in fact had personally been given the chance to run Nosenko, an opportunity he refused. He didn't accept that job from the 14th Department. So, I would think if you're willing to accept Bagley, that's the sort of proof you're looking for. Did Bagley get a file? No, but he got it from a very good source. However, the CIA, some of their voices there would raise, impugning Bagley, say, well, where's the file, and where's Khrandashev's documentation, and the people in this cadre around Khrandyshev, how come their names are conveniently not identified?
Yeah, I guess I would, to those questions, I would also add, even in the lack of a file and even in the lack of identification of who these other names are, what are some specifics, right? So to just say, for Khrandyshev to say, Nosenko was a dispatched agent, I'd still like to know, what did he do after he was a dispatched agent, if he was a dispatched agent?
Yeah, and that's why I think we need a congressional investigation to get to the bottom of this. I mean, wouldn't that be fun to read? I mean, you also, think or are implying that you can get these easy answers in these files. How many years has it been since Kennedy was shot? Do you think you know everything? Or not you, that one knows everything? I mean, I think there are still secrets buried away. That's, the thing one learns about intelligence agencies. One of my earlier books, I go to the CIA and I'm meeting with this official, and I'm saying I want to tell the true story about this case. And he starts laughing. And he says, well, you're never going to get the true story. You might get what we want to release. And secrets are the currency of intelligence agencies, their capital that they don't want to touch, and they put away for rainy days or moods or strike whenever a certain mood strikes them. And we just haven't gotten it all yet. And one of the purposes of my book is to say, hey, we've been accepting something as either black or white, and we need to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah, although I think an exception to what you just said might be that window of time in the early 90s when a lot of Russians who were in possession of KGB files, could get cash for selling those files, and the Soviet Union was gone, and they didn't have a great need to protect those files. So I think there was that rare window where suddenly you could get a lot more information than in
the
other
files
times.
They had access to. And some were based on memory. They would even have to memorize what they had and write it down. But the 14th Department files, the Gribanov group, I haven't seen those files ever being released, and I don't know if we ever will.
So let's move ahead to the suicide, which is that's where the book starts. And that's an extremely intriguing episode. And I think one of the great things this book does is really focus a lot on that. A lot of the other stuff, we've been arguing a lot because there've been a lot of other things written about a lot of the other stuff. But the suicide stuff, I think you dig in deeper on than anyone else really has done. There were some newspaper accounts at the time, but you go a lot deeper than that. So talk about that.
I think it's September 1978, bright autumn day on the Chesapeake Bay. There's a sailing boat, the Brillig is its name, out of Lewis Carroll, goes aground. The Coast Guard goes to investigate. They see bullets, unfired cartridges on the deck. They go below into the galley. They find secret government papers mentioning things like satellites and missile telemetry. They find a row of electronic equipment, and one of the devices is later identified as a burst transmitter, which is a way to communicate with satellites, often used by spies to send messages in quick bursts to these satellites for later decryption. They find a briefcase that, when they go through the papers, identifies or says the owner is a John Arthur Paisley, who's working as in effect, a newspaper delivery man for the Washington Post. And the letter is chastising Paisley, saying that I haven't received all my papers, but I'm still paying you nonetheless. And there's no sign of the boat's owner. Later, it's decided that the boat's owner is John Arthur Paisley, a retired CIA official. 10 days after the boat is first found, a body wrapped in 36 pounds of chains still manages to float up to the surface. The CIA, the body has been ravaged by the Maryland Bay crabs. The CIA, however, says that this is the body of John Arthur Paisley. They can't get fingerprints because not only have the fingerprints been washed away or been ruined by the water, but the CIA says, incredibly, that they've lost the fingerprint records for John Arthur Paisley. There's a very quick autopsy. The autopsy identifies him as 5'10". He's wearing briefs that are size 32. Later, it turns out that Paisley is 5'7" and has 36-inch waist. None of this makes sense. The body is quickly cremated. His wife, the CIA claims his wife gives permission. The wife later says she didn't give permission. And that's the end of the mystery until a local reporter on the Maryland shore gets a hold of it. And then the CIA adds fuel to the fire. They've made a whole career about telling lies. You think they'd be good at it, but they immediately start saying some outrageous ones, that Paisley was a low-ranking official and that he was completely retired and had no access to confidential documents. But it turns out later that he was a high-ranking official on the white side, as you said before, the analyst side, and he had gone back to work on special projects for the CIA, if in fact he ever did retire.
Yeah, I mean, so you brought to light quite a lot of detail there that I think makes a strong case that this may not have been Paisley whose body was found. But I want to poke around a little bit about, I think the only real motive that you mention in the book for why he would choose that time to flee, perhaps clandestinely flee the country and move to the Soviet Union, was that he was told that he was going to be subject to a routine polygraph test that essentially all CIA officers of his rank are routinely subject to. That part I was a little, wondering about. Do you really think that would be enough to cause somebody to walk away from this, even if he was living a double life, to walk away from this double life that he'd been living his whole life and flee to the Soviet Union?
Perhaps that was the straw that broke the camel's back, because at this point, his life is in chaos. He's acting bizarrely. He's putting ads in newspapers about a wallet that's missing, yet he later is seen with the wallet and has the credit cards. He's acting in an erratic way. And also there's a CIA officer who has identified to the CIA security office that Paisley is his chief suspect for being a mole. It's this fingering, if you will, of Paisley that forces the CIA Office of Security to look at him a bit, and they find out that he hasn't been flooded or hasn't had a lie detector for well over 20 years, when people are in his positions are usually at least every other year should go through a lie detector test. So they send him a very routine letter saying, we're going to do the background check, talk to your relatives, and all this seems to build ahead in Paisley's world. Perhaps that he sends a distress message to his handlers, get me out of here. The jig is up.
He wasn't. Although you note that they wanted to give him a lie detector test in part because another high-ranking CIA officer had suspected Paisley of being a mole. Paisley's not told that, right? He doesn't know that he's under suspicion of being a mole. He just gets a very anodyne letter saying you need to get your routine lie detector test, right?
Well, did he know about the other suspicions? You and I don't know. You don't know what his sources were in the agency. And just the fact that one gets a letter like that after so many years, all this coming together, could have lit a spark. I mean, it's very hard to say when an agent in place falls apart. You referred to the Philby spy ring. Did those guys have to run when they did to France initially, Burgess and McLean? Did both of them have to go? I think there's some question of that. I mean, they were moving in on them. They could feel what was happening, but I think not both at that time. I think it's living behind enemy lines takes its toll.
Yeah, I think McLean definitely had to go at that time, but Burgess would be the one where you could have a debate about that. But McLean had actually been tipped by Philby that he was about to be arrested, so he would have been arrested the next day. Also with Paisley, I mean, a lie detector test. If he would have failed the lie detector test, then that might have affected his job status at the CIA. But it wouldn't. A lie detector is not even admissible in court. He couldn't have been in any criminal trouble for that. There would have needed to be some other kind of evidence against him.
I think as a lawyer, you're looking at this in a much too legalistic way. Here is a man who had been possibly working as a double agent for a decade, 2 decades, whatever, and suddenly a flurry of events are throwing his whole world, turning it upside down. He had just also left his wife. He seemed to be a man who was experiencing chaos. I think I'm certainly not a psychologist, but I think you can see that he was in the midst of having a breakdown of some sort. So his life was going around in tatters. He was talking about to telling people he wanted to go back to his merchant marines. I mean, things that made no logical sense. And I think this letter from the CIA Office of Security, which he could very well believe was just the tip of the iceberg in their suspicions, especially if you have a secret that you're hiding, sent him in to say, get me out of here. And he reached out, and I believe that's what happened. I mean, when also you look, I said before, some of the things when you look at the suicide, it made no sense. Even the bullet wound that he received, as the official investigation said, he wrapped himself up in 36 pounds of chains, has to hobble to the side of the deck. He then throws himself into the water, and while in midair, he's right-handed. He reaches across his head and shoots himself behind the left ear with this gun, which is never found. It just doesn't work. I mean,
yeah, I was persuaded by that. Although I am curious whose body could it have been?
So am I. It'd be very interesting to find out. Was it just someone that had been found by some hobo in the streets of Washington, or whose? It's a real mystery. And again, one of the questions that you'd like to have the answer to. I mean, just as in the Kennedy assassination, one can list all the questions that still remain. So one can in this Paisley quote-unquote suicide.
And also, I was interested in a possible alternative hypothesis, which is that, I think you were very persuasive in the facts you lined up to say this was more likely than not somebody else's body, not Paisley's. Paisley may not have died there, probably didn't die there. But I wonder about the leap from that to thinking that necessarily means he fled to the Soviet Union, rather than just thinking he was trying to engineer his own disappearance and just, take up some different identity somewhere here in the United States. It's not an uncommon phenomena for people. I mean, that doesn't happen every day, but it's not unheard of for people to kind of, fake their own death so they can get a fresh start. And they don't all go to the Soviet Union. So I'm sort of wondering, what your thoughts on that were.
Well, I, as an investigator, was never able to establish what happened to Paisley after this suicide. You asked a very good question. Whose body was that? I do know, and I tell the story about what Krondashev tells Pete Begley in Moscow, that Begley is taken to a cemetery in Moscow and not told directly, but the implication is that Paisley is buried here under an assumed name by the 14th Department. Did he go directly to Moscow? Did he live for some time in the States? His wife receives a strange postcard from South America, I think Peru. Was he down there? Was that sent by a Soviet agent? These are all questions that I think that linger, that make this story, which is a story about an investigation, about a quest, so resonating and call for, I think, a new investigation with governmental powers to get to the bottom of things.
Yeah. Now, last thing I'll ask about Bagley's conclusion, and then I'll ask just for some larger thoughts, is so Bagley more or less concludes that based on the evidence that you've just summarized, that Paisley was the big mole, and that Paisley, in fact, was responsible for some of the most famous blown operations, including, for instance, the Colonel Peter Popov, who was one of our top agents in place in the Soviet Union during the Cold War, getting apprehended and arrested and executed. Now, Bagley, had previously in his own book, not that long ago, but in 2007, identified Edward Ellis Smith, a CIA security officer who had been fired from the American embassy in Moscow, as the mole who had blown the Popov operation. But now he's identified Paisley as the mole who blew the same operation. And it's I certainly understand.
I think he theorized in that book that was, and again, you said, I don't think he was the main source. I think later he realized that Paisley was the conduit for this information to the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the reason I bring up that point, it's not that I certainly do accept that, by the time Bagley was talking to you now, that he had more information than he had back when he wrote Spy Wars. I get all that. People change their minds based on new evidence, and that's a good thing. But I'm just sort of a little bit have concerns about the kind of cast of mind that sort of, that I think is the sort of monster plot or sick think cast of mind that just sort of starts from the idea, well, there's a big mole, and so I'll name this person. If it's not that, I'll name this person. If it's not that, I'll name this person. And I just wonder if this is Bagley, just doing more of that.
I think, being a detective, you have many suspects, and you keep on building your case the more information you get. And this was his ultimate conclusion. Was he right? Well, again, that's why we need this congressional investigation. I mean, in many ways, this is like an Hercule Poirot mystery when you think, well, it's, the butler did it. No, it's the candlestick maker. You find out later on. I mean, you can be wrong and still ultimately be right. I think he starts with the sense that these are not accidents, that these cases are blown, and we're not being told, we being not just the CIA, but the American people, the whole story. Something else is going on, that our enemy is involved in aggressive counterintelligence. And he then goes on this path to try to find the answers. In a Le Carré novel, George Smiley at the end of the day can pick out the one man, and that's it. And it's nice and clean and neat. Real life is a bit more complicated.
Absolutely. And that leads me to, I guess, what will be my last big question to you, which is, as you noted before.
I'll have my last big answer then.
Okay, yeah. You talked about when we were briefly talking about Dave Murphy, you noted that the French intelligence services were penetrated. And of course, the British intelligence services were very famously massively penetrated, and the West German intelligence services were penetrated. And it might be true, as you posit, that our intelligence services were also penetrated. So I guess, would you say that it was actually the Soviets rather than the West that won the intelligence wars?
I would think, sadly, so. I think that's a conclusion, and I just hope it's not the case right now. We've been talking about the past, and one of the values we've been hearing about lately, and again, my knowledge is just what I read in the New York Times about American intelligence being able to help the Ukrainians. And they've been talking about military spies in the sky, etc. I wonder if there are agents in place or ground observers or even moles that are helping the Americans pass information on to the Ukrainians now. But at that stage, in that stage of the Cold War, we sure took a beating thanks to faults in our intelligence activities.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would agree. I agree that the Soviets won the human intelligence war, but that kind of leads me to my second question, which is, why fight the human intelligence war? What's the point of it? We've got signals intelligence. We did win the Cold War. What's the point of being involved in the human intelligence war?
I don't. There are many people who would agree that human intelligence has its day is past. I wouldn't. I think an agent in the field, a man in place in Moscow Center, is going to get the sort of information that an eye in the sky can never get, that a buggy in a phone could never get. I think flesh and blood and breathing agents inside the enemy's camp will always be the gold standards for gathering intelligence.
Well, if you agree that we won the Cold War, even though we lost the human intelligence war, I know this is a little counterfactual, but what do you think would have gone differently if we had won the human intelligence war?
I mean, you're asking me to rewrite history. And what is winning? What is win? I mean, is winning that the fact that there's peace, but our our defense budget seems to be affecting our American way of life, our schools, our neighborhoods, our communities. Winning is in the eye of the beholder, I think, and I'd have to give a lot more thought to what you mean for larger understanding. I think we could debate for days about what winning actually means. We have a black intelligence budget. I think it's $80 billion a year on projects that we're not even aware of. I did a New York Times piece recently about a man who conned the Beltway, and he was able to literally steal billions of this money. Is that winning? The money that goes into the black budget that's being wasted? I'm not sure.
No, I agree. I'd like to shut it down. That's really what I'm saying. I don't think there's any benefit in running a CIA that's involved in clandestine operations. I think But
then what will we talk about? It's sort of all right about it.
Yeah. No, I love reading about the Cold War, and I think there's a lot more to be said about it. But I think the verdict of history is basically out. In fact, when you talk about the present, I wonder what your thoughts about this would be. It seems to me that probably one of the best uses of American intelligence that I think I've ever seen is President Biden openly revealing, in public press conferences recently on a number of times, we know that the Soviets are going to invade this place on this date, and kind of wrong-footing Putin by doing that. Now, I take it that all of that information is coming from signals intelligence, and that it's being used in an open, public, and transparent way, so that there's no human intelligence element here, really, and there's nothing clandestine about it.
Well, one interpretation of why Biden did that, and it's fascinating that he did it, is that we have someone close to the Russians military, Russian plans, and that person was becoming under suspicion. So if the president then comes out and points it in effect on signals intelligence, the suspicion that was being focused on this agent in place behind enemy lines would go away. Is that possible? I don't know. It's a good novel, though.
It's possible, but I would say it's unlikely because of the quantity of the information.
Right? I actually think it's really unlikely that why Biden would make that so clear, why the U.S. Secretary of Defense would make that so clear that we're giving them this information, because it also puts us, if Russia's looking for an excuse to expand their war, it puts U.S. in the crosshairs, or it puts certainly NATO countries in the crosshairs.
The fact that we're announcing that we're able to monitor their communications, and that we know when they're going to invade,
and reconnaissance flights, whatever, it takes away plausible deniability that we're passing on this information to the Ukrainians, and therefore Russia is looking for an excuse to justify expanding the war to NATO. Here we are providing them with one.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm advocating, is that it's a good thing to take away that plausible deniability, that all the secrecy never benefited the United States, and that just open transparency about things like this would benefit the United States more. That's really what my point I was trying to make is. I don't see the benefit. This idea that the Soviets, they were able to be so much more effective at the secret wars than Western intelligence was. I feel like that got them nothing. Right, and that there's just no benefit to winning those kind of wars, and that the benefit is to doing things that'll affect tactical geopolitics, I guess, like saying we know that Putin's about to invade here, and just wrong-footing him by publicly announcing that. I guess you just we can just disagree on that, or you can respond to that if you want.
Well, I'll let it just, your opinion is valid. I'm not sure if it's right or wrong. I think Putin, put aside the Ukraine, has pursued a policy of aggressive counterintelligence, tracking down enemy agents, hacking U.S. elections. What has he gained by that? Well, it's allowed him to maintain this image of Mother Russia. It's allowed him to remain in power. Or these moves in an end game, which he sees Russia becoming a true world power again. It's a world power now, largely because it has a nuclear arsenal.
Yeah. Well, if we had perfect human intelligence, I guess what I'll let you go in a sec. I see. Yeah. If we had perfect human intelligence, what would be the benefit of what would be the most beneficial use right now? Like if we could place spies, any place we wanted to, and they would be effective and they would be undiscovered, how would that affect, say, what's going on in Ukraine now? How could we best deploy them to affect what's going on in Ukraine right now?
You're asking me to play novelist. Okay, if I can embed a spy in the Kremlin, I sure would like to know what Putin's end game is and what's he going to do next. And, living in a nuclear age where we're facing an enemy that has nuclear weapons, I sure would like to know how serious he is about using them. These are all questions that I think an agent in place could conceivably get. And if I were making the decisions, if I were advising the President of the United States, what is the job of intelligence? It's not to make decisions, it's to provide information to the decision makers so that they can make those decisions. And these would all be valuable to know.
Well, I will give you the last word. I'm sorry I kept you so much over. Thank you so much.
I actually had a great time talking to you, and I appreciate your knowledge and your erudition. It was just great. So it's fun to talk to someone who knows the area. Like I do, you probably know it better than I do, and that to me is just it's gratifying and an education. And this is what I do. It's fun. I love it.
Yeah, I love it too, and I really appreciate your giving me all this time and standing up to my interrogation as well as you did. It was terrific. So this was Howard Blum, author of The Spy Who Knew Too Much, with an extended episode of the Politics Guys interview. The book comes out June 6th?
June 7th.
June 7th, and it is published by HarperCollins, and it should be available in all physical and online bookstores everywhere, I suppose.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure speaking with you. Take care. Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this Politics Guys interview, and if you did, we'd really appreciate it if you could mention us on social media or however else you share things you like. It would also be great if you could rate and review us on your podcast app. If you got a question, comment, correction, gripe, manifesto, whatever, you want to share it with us, you can reach us a bunch of ways. Mail at politicsguys.com, as well as there's our supporters exclusive Discord channel, and we're also on Facebook and Twitter. And if you'd like to become a supporter of the show, you can find out more about that at patreon.com/politicsguys or politicsguys.com/support. And links to all that are always in our show notes. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Ryan Beasley. We'll be back with a new episode this coming weekend. We hope you'll join us.